Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this French press lunch on the software policy paper from Free ICT Europe. I'm Sergio Fernandez, the co-founder of Intelli, and I'm accompanying Free ICT Europe in Brussels, in front of the EU institutions. First of all, let me introduce our three speakers today. First and foremost, we start with Thomas O'Leary. Thomas shouldn't be confused with his fellow Irish countryman and former rugby player, but Thomas has always worked in the ICT industry since he joined IBM in 1995. And in 2008, he founded Origina, transforming a small Irish IT service company into the leading independent IBM software maintenance company in the world, with now offices in Dublin, London, and Dallas. And Thomas is strongly involved in Free ICT Europe, chairing the foundation since 2017. Let me then present you Jan Hoogstraat. He's Dutch, and Jan has been working in the ICT world since 2001 when he joined CBE. He's very involved in Free ICT Europe as well since the beginning, and is the executive director of the foundation since 2016, with the goal to support the development of an open and sustainable secondary market in Europe for service, maintenance, resale of ICT hardware and software. It's worth noting as well that Jan is also a member of the EU MSP advisory group on ICT standardization. And last but not least, we have Dan Shefet. Dan is a French lawyer born in Denmark and is holding a philosophy degree and law degree from the University of Copenhagen. He's very well-known, specialized in European law, in competition law, as well as human rights in general, and in the IT environment in particular, giving conference in academic venues on those topics. Dan also founded in 2014 the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy, with the main objective to introduce a general principle of accountability on the internet in order to secure the protection of human integrity. So today we are going to present you this policy paper to make you as well understand that there are very strong barriers currently hindering the development of EU technology sector. But without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Thomas for some introductory words. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Sergio, and thank you very much, everybody. Listen, this is a very big day for Free ICT Europe. I'm very proud to be leading the organization for the last number of years, having been involved in the foundation of the organization with my colleague Jan and a number of others since 2014. We've done a number of couple of very things we're very proud of along the journey over the last 8 years, and this is one of them, being able to produce, with the help of Dan Shefet, a good friend of mine, to focus on policy recommendations which would help to kind of provide balance to the competitiveness of the EU technology sector. We in Free ICT, we're a non-profit. We are here to actively promote the ICT secondary market. We promote it for both participants in the secondary market, but also for the users and the beneficiaries of the secondary market, which are the businesses that work with our donors and our supporters on the participation side. Our goal is always to highlight where we see inequalities in the marketplace. We see anti-competitive behavior, or in many cases, things that can be done an awful lot better, with the view to promoting fairness and fair play in the technology tech sector, and then ultimately to provide choice. This paper, as Dan will explain later, and Jan will just outline a couple of key points from our perspective, is really important because the software industry is clearly a critical component to the ICT sector here in Europe and globally. Increasingly, software is everywhere, and this is a challenge for all businesses. How do we continue to provide innovation and choice within an environment when, in many cases, the intellectual property rights are retained for a significantly long period of time by providers who may or may not be European organizations. And oftentimes, actually, you find that past 10 years, there's very little else being done with intellectual property rights. So we're very much encouraged by this paper. We think it is an important contribution to the debate in Europe. We think it's an important contribution to businesses to review, particularly those who are heavily invested in technology, whether it be legacy technology or looking to the future to digitalize their businesses increasingly. As we see through the whole pandemic, the importance of technology is critical. It's not just from a point of view of availability, but also from a security perspective. And things like this create an environment where you have a much more shared approach to providing technology innovation. And with that technology innovation, you will get a much more secure and stable environment. So very, very much encouraged. Delighted that we at Free ICT are able to participate in this, and that Dan has produced this in collaboration with us. And really looking forward to seeing how this is received by the Commission, by the Parliament in Brussels, here in Brussels. And I really encourage all of you to read it and to listen to what we have to say and to debate this with us, because we're very much open to the debate, because I think it's an important thing to continue to do that. Thank you very much to Dan again. I'll pass back to Sergio, who'll take on the next stage, and look forward to receiving any questions that may come at the end of this short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for these words. Before giving the floor to Dan, the main author of this paper, I would like to ask Jan to have a few words on what are, in your opinion, the biggest and the most important aspects of this paper that you would like to highlight.
Well, there are a few aspects, but I think we first need to take a look on where we're coming from. Well, software is relatively new in our society, in our businesses, and it made an impressive growth. Yeah, so the impact to our businesses, also the education, the public sector, and also our private lives has become huge. We are depending on it more and more. And it drives our lives, and also the spending side is significant these days. And I think when the first legislation steps were taken, not all the facts have been truly considered. And I think we are now reviewing the market situation. It's time to take some action. And well, next to the core of software is being the applications. The software is also embedded in parts of hardware, and it has a direct link with sustainability. And as such, it impacts the use and the life cycle of the products that we operate privately, but also, of course, in our businesses, also large systems. And for those things that we own, we want to have the freedom of choice. Yes. And when we own it, the IP, intellectual property rights, has been exhausted, and still we are bound with the supplier or the vendor when it comes to software. We are not just free to do with it what we want and to decide, for instance, how this will be maintained, which we choose for anything of our house, of our cars, or any other equipment that a company is owning, and the production environment, etc. So this journey of the software, as I may call it, is become such an important one. And maybe the first change in view to this was coming from the European Court of Justice, when they perceived this and said with some conditions, for instance, that the resale of a license is possible, making it more and more comparable between a hidden box to a tangible good, which is then tradable, for instance. This ruling came with a growing insight, and we think we are coming to a next level as well and getting better understanding of what software is and the impact it does have. So if you can compare it, maybe you love the songs of U2 or Beyonce or the Beatles or the books of Dan Brown and the paintings of Picasso. These are special works, artistic works, and they have special protection. And when we then come to the protection around software, that's totally different. This is machine code. It is not a special act in that way. So it should also not be put on the same level of protection like artistic works. And as Thomas explained already, there's a lot of protection around this, and we have this listed in the paper as well. So this is for a long time, and it limits the operations, it limits the interfaces, interoperability, and also on the maintenance side around this software. This needs to change, these protection rules, as the limits are really putting the options, also reducing the options that we have as users, as owners for the products we use, and it will increase the cost of the products, the services, and the software itself. We have been restricted up to now, and that's also, it's harming both the economy but also the circular economy. Well, this is I think a key element of the paper that Dan will put forward to you. I hope you will enjoy the explanation and absolutely take a good read of the document later on. And thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Jan. Dan, given your background as an activist and given the lack of, let's say that this problematic is bringing somewhat in the table a lack of freedom of choice for consumers or businesses. So I assume that was one of your motivation to join this fight. So can you present us this policy paper and everything you would like to highlight? And just before giving you the floor, just would like to remind that we will have a Q&A session after that, and that if in the audience someone has a question, just type it in the chat, and we will then I will get back to our speakers. If you could just present briefly yourself before asking the question, so that we have a bit of background, that will be brilliant. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. It's a true pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. I think it is extremely important that we have this occasion to discuss, and I look forward to the Q&As afterwards, the ideas embedded in this policy paper, which I invite everybody to read. Of course, I shall mention some of the major principles that we try to convey in this policy paper, but I think it will be very helpful if we afterwards, read it in detail, and then if you have any questions, you're very welcome to send me an email, or maybe send the email to ICT asking those questions after you've had time to study the paper. You were so kind, Sergio, as to mention that I am also active in human rights. And actually, what I would like to say here in intro is that you may ask yourselves, what has human rights got to do with the subject that we are discussing today? Well, I invite you on this particular point to have a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27.2. Let me just read that to you. Everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and the material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. Of course, it's very important here to see that the word technical production does not appear as a human right. And this brings us to precisely to what Jan mentioned, the difference that we have to make between creative artistic work, which is protected as a human right by the Universal Declaration, and everything else. Science is also protected, so I should say not everything else, I agree, but technical is not protected. And so in the Universal Declaration from 1948, a distinction was already made between creative work and technical work. Unfortunately, that distinction has not been continued throughout the legislative developments that we have seen in terms of software protection. I just want to mention another historic event. I love history, be warned. I love it as a subject in its own, but also because we can learn so much from history, also where we make mistakes. Now, do you all know where typically we say that intellectual property rights, when it was created, so to speak? Well, I shall answer that question. In the 6th century. And this is important because we no longer live in the 6th century. The story goes that it was kind of like 560. There is some debate as to the specific year, but that doesn't matter. It was the 6th century in Ireland. And here, Thomas, I hope you can help me because I don't know how to pronounce the name in Gaelic, but it's called the Battle of Cúl Dreimhine or something like that. Is that right, Thomas?
You'll have to spell it for me again, but you're the expert in intellectual property.
Okay, well, certainly not in Gaelic pronunciations. So let's just say that the right pronunciation is the Battle of Cúl Dreimhine, which apparently took place in 560, at least in the 6th century. And this is historically deemed to be the first intellectual property right dispute. This is where the famous words of the then king saying that if you own the cow, you also own the calf. I think we all remember that quotation, which actually is meant to mean that if you own the book, you also own the copies. Again, 6th century. This led not only to this actually, according to the historic accounts that I have found, 3,000 people died at this battle, which had to do with the unauthorized copying of a religious book by someone who apparently started this war. Again, I may be wrong here on who started what, but at least the battle did take place and is typically credited with being the first battle of copyright protection in the world. 6th century. These are the concepts. This is the legal foundation of what we still work with today in the 21st century. I also want to mention another historic event, which is deemed to have taken place in the 19th century. I don't know whether this is true. I tried to check the facts and double check the facts. There are different stories about this, but the story as I've seen it goes that Berlioz, the French composer, one day was sitting at a sidewalk cafe in Paris, and it just occurred to him that it was rather strange that people playing his music didn't pay him anything for them, even though they made money on playing his music, which according to that story, which may be true, led to applying copyright protection not only to literary works, but also to music. I mention all of this because it's really time that we revisit the idea of this more or less automatic copyright protection to software. When I say more or less automatic, that is really not 100% true, because in the 60s, 70s, and culminating in the 80s, there was much debate, as you probably know, as to whether copyright, as to whether software should be or could be protected at all, and if so, what would be the appropriate protection. There were lots of reports written by before the Congress in the US and national reports and so on all over the world. Funnily enough, IBM took the position that software should not be protected at all. They had various reasons for doing that. It was mainly because their business model at the time was based on licensing hardware, which you couldn't actually purchase at the time. You could only lease it, and therefore they were interested in promoting and reinforcing the hardware installed base by having software free of charge to run on that base. That, of course, changed over time, as we very well know. But that was one theory, that it wasn't protected at all. The second theory was that, of course, patent protection. And as we know today, there is some software that attains a certain level of scientific or technological criteria, which allows it to be patent protected, but most of it is not patent protected. So the big debate was, how should we then protect software? And there seemed to be consensus, and now there is consensus, which we find in laws all over the world, including in the European Union with the software directive, that software is protected by copyright. But it's important that when we look at it from a historic perspective, that was not preordained at all. And we should not be misled today, again, in the 21st century, where we have very, very important new technical developments. And I'm, of course, thinking of the internet, which has created its own legal environment and its own open source access of software, algorithms, and so on and so forth, which also spills into artificial intelligence. A whole community now thrives on open sources and APIs and so on and so forth, which actually allows a very vibrant development of software on the internet. So it is time that we revisit the whole thing. Maybe it was the right thing to do in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to be inspired what happened at the Battle of Kul Dremini, or whatever it's called, but it's certainly no longer the case as far as we in this panel are concerned. The question that we always have to ask ourselves is, of course, whether protection stifles innovation or whether it promotes innovation. Now, that is a century-long debate. We've seen that debate resurfacing right now under a different angle, which is, of course, the COVID vaccines. I'm sure that you will follow what happens here, that even the Biden administration proposes that certain vaccines, that is the Pfizer vaccine, should no longer enjoy intellectual property protection. It should be kind of like common human heritage, which is a very interesting concept as such, and how that would maybe inspire future research, not only in the medical field, but also in other fields of science and technology, opening up more and more, will be very, very, very interesting to follow. We really don't know whether IP protection promotes innovation or stifles innovation. There are just as many theories and positions and research papers about this on one side as there is on the other side. But today, what we do know is that apart from the trend that I just described, we do know that IP protection, as we see it in the software area and even in the latest European directive from 2009, is no longer adapted to the internet and is no longer adapted to society as such. I said that we do know that. Of course, we have to prove that we do know that. I agree, but I think that we can all agree that the cost to society and to the taxpayer of intellectual property on software is enormous. I would be very interested to see a study of just each of the member states of the European Union as to what the taxpayer has to pay for maintenance of software on an installed base, as a consequence of the scope of that protection to software maintenance, patches, fixes, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that there are lots of good reasons why the European Union might take a look at that, just the cost to society of such what I call extravagant or even abusive use of intellectual property. The crux of the paper, from a policy point of view, is to distinguish between true creative, artistic intellectual property, as Jan also mentioned, and the technical intellectual property, which again is not protected as a human right. The difference between the two is very well described in the following citation from the wonderful book on the subject, Adrian Jones' book on the title is Piracy from 2009. And the quotation is the following: almost every significant invention since the printing press had been claimed by several rivals. By contrast, it is ridiculous to imagine that any two authors could have invented, quote unquote, the Divine Comedy by Dante. And that is precisely the point. There is an enormous difference between the creative effort which is invested in artistic creations. It's almost like a revelation. It's that kind of thing on the one hand, and on the other hand, technical work, which today is no longer, when we talk about software, the result of one individual author, but as we all know, of an organization. So authorship is different. The basis of arriving at the so-called invention is completely different, and putting these two completely different things into the same category of protection seems to me today, to put it mildly, not to be adapted, and certainly not to current society. And that is really the gist again of our policy paper. In terms of some of the recommendations, it is, you can read six specific recommendations in it, but one of the things that we would like to see is that the duration of protection be severely limited from what it is today. I mean, can you all imagine that copyright today is protected 50 years, even 75 years, and that seems to me could be completely ridiculous in terms of software protection. Even if it is reduced to 20 years, it's much too long. What we would like to see is 2 or 5 years maximum. And actually there is something interesting here, because what you could say is that the protection that you afford to companies that develop software, and let's just call it copyright protection, even though I wouldn't call it copyright protection, I would call it license protection. So the protection that we offer to companies that develop software, this kind of license protection, is really, or should really reflect a deal with society. What do we get in return for giving them this monopoly right for a certain number of years, 2 or 5 or whatever it is, to exploit commercially their product? What I was saying is that in terms of maintenance, what we should get in return for that is that when they put a product on the market, it's really rather strange that if that product is flawed, the user has to pay by way of an overpriced maintenance agreement to fix the flawed product. That is actually what happens today. You put a product on the market, it doesn't work, and afterwards you tell the user, okay, we know it doesn't work, but you have to pay to make it work, and we know how to make it work. This is really, from a legal and ethical point of view, rather strange to defend and justify, isn't it? So I would say that the deal that we would be looking at in order to give these companies that have some sort of protection, and I would call it license protection, would be, first of all, that they would be under an obligation, if they want to have license protection to the product as such, to maintain it. And if they don't, not only would they run into a product liability problem or consumer law problem, but they would forfeit their license protection. Whatever it takes to maintain their own flawed product must be made available free of charge for anybody to use. Otherwise, they shouldn't put that product on the market, or otherwise they forfeit the license protection. This I know is pretty revolutionary, but I think it makes very good sense today. And it would solve also the abusive pricing practices that we've seen, which were in no way envisaged to be the case when the when copyright protection was awarded to software. So these are some of the ideas historic, ethical, legal, and so on, which led us to this policy paper, which of course has many more concrete proposals. One of the proposals, just to mention one now, and then I look forward to the Q&A, will also be that all public procurement of software products in the future, whether it be at the EU Commission level or the member state level, should be based on an obligation to allow third-party maintainers to maintain that software. And of course, the reason would be that that would bring down the prices enormously, basically for the taxpayers in Europe and elsewhere. So these are some of the ideas, and I look forward to the Q&As.
Yeah, before moving to the Q&As, Dan, I think it could be interesting if you can present briefly what are the recommendations that we can find on your paper for the audience.
Yes, I mentioned, I'll just find the recommendation page here. I mentioned probably the most important ones. In terms of public procurement, and in terms of the quid pro quo, or the deal, so to speak, that in return for a reduced license protection period, open access should be given to patches and fixes for maintainers. I think those two are the most important ones, but we have let me read the recommendations on page 10 of the policy paper. Recommendation number 1, policymakers should amend the current legal framework to clarify the distinction between artistic intellectual property rights and industrial property rights. That is also what I call technical property rights. And again, this distinction reflects the distinction made in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The recommendation number 2 would be reinforce the protection on artistic creativity, and that's, as far as we are concerned, something that may be necessary precisely because of what we see on the internet these days, but that only applies to artistic creativity. We already seen that the European Commission has taken such action on the uploading filters and so on and so forth. And as far as we're concerned, we have no problem with that. On the contrary, and it again underlines the difference between artistic creativity and industrial, quote unquote, creativity. The length of computer program protection should be reduced. What we suggest is 2 years. We recommend that we should remove or reaffirm the inapplicability of moral rights to computer programs. The reason that moral rights are mentioned here is that moral rights follow from the application of copyrights, authorship, and moral rights. Moral rights, as you probably know, relate to the fact or to the legal theory that copyright protection also means that if somebody somehow presents the protected work in a way that you personally or your heirs find derogatory and simply that you don't accept it, you have the right to object to that. That makes no sense in terms of technical inventions. There are no moral rights. What we're talking about is code, it's math. Again, it underlines the fact that software should not be covered by copyright category at all. It makes no sense to talk about moral rights to software. Recommendation number 5, remove the notion of neighboring or related rights from the scope of copyright protection afforded to computer programs. That is also one of that's actually a French theory, the neighboring rights, the droit voisin. Again, that is something that only fits into the creative or the artistic category of copyright, which in my opinion is the only category that deserves copyright protection. Recommendation number 6, allow derivative works to a much larger extent by obliging the copyright holder to open up to interfaces, interoperability, and maintenance. That's what we discussed as the quote unquote deal. We all understand that intellectual property rights really reflects some sort of contract between society and the rights holder. That's why I use the word the deal. It's also interesting from a historic perspective here that we already talked about copyright being born in the 6th century. Patent rights, according to history, and there's consensus that this was born in the 15th century in Venice. And it was clear that it was a deal. It was a patent is a right awarded by the region, by the king or whoever it is, to a certain company or to a certain individual for a certain number of years to exploit commercially a certain invention. So it is a deal given by society to someone in recognition of what is believed to be the importance and the contribution of that invention to society. Again, this kind of philosophy no longer applies in general, and it certainly does not apply to software protection the way it applies to artistic creativity. Recommendation number 7, which is very much inspired by the Digital Governance Act. As you know, the European Commission has now presented 3 drafts. One is the Digital Services Act, one is the Digital Marketing Act, and one is the Digital Governance Act. And in that Digital Governance Act, we find compulsory licensing, which of course in that act applies to data. There's no reason why it shouldn't also apply to maintenance, to the extent that something is IP protected. That we can find a lot of inspiration in this Digital Governance Act to create a system of compulsory licensing. Maybe that is also the system that will be applied in the big debate with Pfizer in terms of COVID. Recommendation number 8. Given that mainframe installations, both within the public and private spheres, are controlled by just a couple of dominating companies, it would also seem natural to apply a gatekeeper regime to those actors as envisaged by the Digital Market Act. And I just referred to the Digital Market Act. The gatekeeper notion here, as you probably know, is one that entails specific obligations, and we could apply those obligations also in the software industry to dominant players. These obligations would again be transparency and access to technology. Recommendation number 9, ensure that public procurement of software licenses throughout the EU be contingent upon the unrestrained availability of alternative maintenance contractors. And I mentioned that before. I think that's extremely important. The EU itself and also the member states, at least in terms of public and administration is concerned, should in their tenders, in their RFPs, simply insist on maintenance being available to third parties. It would bring down the cost and it would be the interest of the taxpayers. So these are our 9 recommendations. The 10s which I mentioned before, which is that in return for the protection that is given, the deal would be that the license beneficiary, because I try not to use the word copyright holder, would be obliged to provide maintenance patches and fixes for the duration that he wants to assert license protection. And those patches and fixes would be a simple consequence of the fact that if he puts a flawed product out on the market, it would be pretty natural that he doesn't get paid for fixing what he put on the market. And that, of course, is something that makes perfect sense. It would obviously be the best solution, which would allow the software developer to maintain a certain license protection for the software as such, and at the same time be in the consumer's interest, be in the third-party maintenance market's interest, and in the taxpayer's interest.
Thank you very much, Dan. So we can move now to the Q&A session. So if you have a question that you would like to ask to the panelists, just use the chat box, and I just remind you to present yourself just before doing so. I have a few questions myself. First of all, to Thomas. You know, we are in the age of an increasing China-US rivalry, and COVID has revealed the critical importance of technology for economic and health resilience, making Europe's digital transformation and sovereignty a question of existential importance. Yourself, as a CEO of a digital company, what do you think the EU should put in place to achieve such a goal?
Yeah, thank you, Sergio. And again, thank you, Dan, for a good summary of the report, the paper. I think there's a number of things that the EU can do to promote both digital transformation, which is a challenge for the entire economy. It's progressing very well in many places, but not in all. But particularly also sovereignty, I think. And today is about some of those things. It's about looking at the rules. I mean, the rules, as Dan has said, in intellectual property are around since the 6th century. And I didn't even know until this morning that it started in Ireland. I, of course, should have known that. But thanks, Dan, as always, for giving me information I knew nothing about. I did have to look at the spelling of cool. Drivna is how it's pronounced, because we pronounce BH and MH like a V. So I didn't hear the spelling correctly, or I wasn't able to translate it in my head. But Cool Drivna was where it was. Apparently, it's county. I had a quick check. It's County Sligo is where it was on the west coast of Ireland. But we're in a different world today, and I think we need to. In Europe, we are behind in lots and lots of places in the technology landscape in terms of our corporate footprint. And even though I think things like the rules around intellectual property started in Europe, and many things started in Europe, we've fallen behind. Well, we can actually catch up again if we start to look at what are the rules. And the rules were designed for one period. We need to see what can be changed. And that's what this paper is about, looking at the applicability of those rules to encourage creativity, to encourage innovation, to encourage speed to market, which is critical for European businesses to be competitive, particularly when you look at that US-China kind of situation. We're almost in the middle geographically and politically and economically. So it feels, but it allows us to give us that economic efficiency that we need. And they're all really important in terms of our competitiveness, but also in the leadership role we take around sustainability. There's a real sustainable kind of angle to this, which we haven't really discussed, that would also need to be put on the table. A simple thing like looking at the withdrawal of support by an intellectual property holder, Microsoft, for their Windows 7 operating system. At the end of 2019, early 2020, there were roughly 200 million devices still running Windows 7, where there was clearly challenges, and really they had no choice but to get off the technology. There was no alternative. The IP rights were still with Microsoft. Windows 7 was 10 or 11 years old, and now it's now gone from support, and nothing else can happen with those devices. A year later, it's estimated now, just over a year in March this year, it was estimated that there's still 100 million devices. So 100 million devices were decommissioned between January 2020 and March 2021. What happened to those devices? Did they need necessarily to be decommissioned physically? And they are physical devices that are now potentially maybe gone through recycling programs, which have limited efficiency, but they have been removed from the planet. And there's a limitation to actually what resources we have available to us. So we must remember that in the argument. There's an economic argument, there's a political argument, but there's also an argument in terms of the environmental impact of some of these decisions, and a more flexible regime in Europe, and taking leadership in some of these areas in places that Europe has been a leader. You look at GDPR, you look at all of the things that we've done in Europe. We are a leader in terms of our legislative landscape, bringing in rules that we can use to the advantage of European business, but also to the advantage of European citizens, and indeed, in many cases, citizens of the entire planet.
Thank you, Thomas. That leads me. That's a perfect transition for the next question I had for Jan. As executive of director of Free ICT, and given the increasing digital connectivity in Europe, I assume that an ICT aftermarket enhancing repair, reuse, and recycling of the products, and then by extension of the software and the firmware to make them work, is of paramount importance for the EU if the EU wants to achieve its circular economy targets. In your opinion, what should be improved in that regard?
So when you look at the role of SMEs in the circular economy, that's really crucial. They are, let's say, the experts in life cycle extension, resale, reuse, make sure that new owners are being found and being serviced. And I think that also on the software side, this is becoming a crucial contribution. So hence the market should be opened up for smaller players, so they can provide the support and resell as well, but making sure that we are not depending on only the big organizations across this world, which are predominantly non-European. So hence, this way we can make sure that we are becoming less dependent on their power, and also the forces, like Thomas is explaining, how this is interacting with the hardware that we're using. And it's not only the smaller devices, it's also the large systems that are being forced to renew, to refresh, because of the higher demands of new software versions, etc., etc. So this will effectively make sure that we are able to use our products for a longer lifetime, reducing the number of equipment that's been sent to e-waste or recycling too early, hence contributing big time to the circular economy. And I think there's a big role for that also with both innovation, but also just for other parts of support around software.
And do you really think that the current framework put in place by the EU is sufficiently enough right now? Or do you think that there are some piece of legislations that are missing, or that should be improved?
Well, I think the problem is that it is touching different areas, and it's to me the discovery journey is just starting. We see some attention from the side of eco-design is stepping up around software and firmware. Also at other elements, yeah, this will become, of course, it's part of IP. It's also a part of how we maybe are purchasing, as also from the public sector. It has impact on several aspects, and I think we will hopefully our paper and our recommendations will be picked up by the different DGs and also with the Parliament to say, okay, what to change, how are we going to do this, and how are we making sure that we are making Europe stronger in this field.
Thank you. I have also a question for Dan. As an experienced lawyer and the writer of those policy recommendations, Dan, I would like to have your thoughts on what, in your opinion, should be the top priority for the EU to address both the competitiveness and the sustainability of this increasing ICT sector?
Okay, Thomas mentioned the leadership of the European Union in terms of regulations. I often have debates with my American friends that do say that Europe is the best in the world at regulating, while we, the Americans, are the best in the world at innovating. And of course, that debate also came up again with the famous interview that Macron gave a couple of weeks ago in France, saying that Europe was not, had lost its appetite for taking risks, which was an explanation why the vaccines against Pfizer were based in the US and not in Europe. There is, of course, some debate as to AstraZeneca, but that is a different story. But so anyway, there may be a case to be made that Europe is better at regulating than at innovating. I'm not sure that one excludes the other at all. And the reason that I mention all of that is that I think that what the European Union should start now, rather sooner than later, is first of all a debate, as they did when they, for instance, when the Commission, for instance, started working on the GDPR, which you all know replaced the directive from 1995. So it took some years, but the big debate surrounding the GDPR was about 2 years between 2016 and 18. And Thomas also mentioned the GDPR. What the European Union is now looking at is artificial intelligence. They came out with a draft regulation on the 21st of April, as you know. Very, very interesting suggestions in there. And so the reason I mention all of that is that I think that the first thing that the European Union should do is put on the table a debate revisiting the appropriate intellectual property right regimes of intangibles in the technological sphere. I'm using those very generic terms. We need a debate like that, just like we had a debate, actually it was even before 2016, but it was mainly from 2016 to 18, like we had it on data protection, and like we have it now on artificial intelligence. It's about time, again, we moved quite a bit since the 6th century. Let's revisit the whole thing about intellectual property rights. What is the regime that is best adapted to technology in the 21st century? I mentioned the 21st century because technological advances on the internet, of course, were not part and parcel at all of the thoughts that lay behind even the software directive from 2009. We had the internet probably since 1919. So it could have inspired the software directive, but it really didn't. I don't see any inspiration there. If we look at the internet today, the last count I made was that there were 11 different licenses on the internet. There may be more. Given in principle the right for everyone to use everything. So there are open licenses, common licenses. It's pretty complicated to understand exactly what the differences are. But the basic philosophy is that everything is available to everybody. And that has created the most vibrant exchange of quote unquote inventions and cooperation worldwide. So maybe the contradiction or the perceived contradiction between innovation and openness no longer exists. Maybe what we have seen on the internet is that even if there is openness about everything, innovation thrives very well, and it is not necessary to give you protection for whatever you have in order to inspire you to innovate. All of that, I think, should be part of the debate that we have today. What is the best for society? What is the best for society in the 21st century in terms of making sure that we get the best innovations out there, the best people out there that are not stifled because of the abuse of dominant position, which is a major problem that, of course, brings me to another angle to answer your question, which is how do we fit competition law into all of this? Jan mentioned small players and big players, and of course in Europe, for whatever reason it is, we seem to be more the small players today, but we are very innovative in Europe. We are extremely innovative, and so we need this European-based debate like we had with the GDPR, like we're having now on AI, on what is the best regime that we can develop in terms of striking the balance between some sort of protection of technological innovation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the best for society and for small business and for creativity. This is the debate that we should have. It may take a couple of years, but that's fine. At least it'll take place, and it will hopefully spread across the Atlantic, just like the GDPR is now spreading across the Atlantic. That's at least the latest news I have. But in the short term, my recommendation would be, and I mentioned it before, that public procurement in the EU should, as a matter of law, when it comes to licensing of software, be contingent upon the software licensor making available patches and fixes free of charge to third-party maintainers. Otherwise, they simply should not be awarded the contract. In addition to that, a distinction should be made between what I call security patches and functional patches of a different nature. If they are security patches, they should also be mandatorily made available. I find it extremely difficult and impossible to justify, actually, if you think it through, that somebody is sitting on knowledge that the product that he's putting on the market and making money on putting on the market suffers not only from a flaw, but a security risk, and charging money to make that security risk available. That makes no sense to me, especially when we look at the risks of cybersecurity today, which is one of the most important risks to society in terms of the very near future, where we see what's happening with attacks on our infrastructure. So I really do not see how we can continue having a regime where these kinds of patches should be protected somehow. They should be made available immediately. And just like maybe the Pfizer vaccine should be made available immediately because it's common human heritage, maybe such security fact patches should also. This is the kind of debate that we have. I know that what I'm saying here may be a bit provocative. I hope it is. I intend it to be. I don't see any debate if you know, as Diogenes, one of my favorite Greek philosophers, says, if a philosopher doesn't offend people, he has no right to exist. So I just hope that this will start a debate. Let's get this on the table. Let's be iconoclastic, and let's make sure that we get a new regime of intellectual property rights adapted to the 21st century and not to the 6th.
Thank you very much, Dan. Seeing it's time to close this press lunch. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Special thanks to Thomas, Jan, and Dan for sharing the floor today. Any final remarks before we close this session, gentlemen?
Just like to say again, thank you very much. This has been, I think this is exactly what we need. We need a debate. We need to be bold, and we need to be brave. And that's exactly what this paper is about. And that's exactly what we promote in Free ICT. So I'm delighted we're able to start this debate, and this is only the start.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we are going to make this policy paper public. And if you have any questions on it, feel free to reach out to Free ICT Europe. We are really looking forward to have a positive impact on society and on the EU as itself. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.